I've spent the last 3 weeks creating a paradox form for all the first 8 Pseudo Legendaries. Each of them got both a future and a past form. We've also started with a different sketching technique, and my pieces got gradually better during this video. Just enjoy this compilation of 20 unique paradox designs. Our first transformation will be for Dratini, since we're doing these in a chronological manner. I want to start by mentioning some huge critique we received in the last weeks, which was that I traced my pieces in order to make them look the best I could. The critique was that I shouldn't trace because they felt like it's a super bad thing to do. I still think tracing was the only reason why I improved as much as I did so far, but I agree, I have to put my pride aside and listen to the feedback. From now on, I will try my best to draw every Pokemon without tracing, but for now I will still recreate the poses from the reference pieces. I believe this is the next logical step in my improvement, and once we perfected that, we'll move on to our own poses. Okay, on to the actual drawing now. We started out by drawing in the head shape, and we immediately changed his mouth into a more dinosaur looking one. We also made sure to change his body into an actual snake shape, a cobra to be specific. The next thing we did was to add a rattle to the tip of his tail, and we extended the gem on his forehead into a small horn. We then turned his head crest into a bigger and hairier version, which then only left us the colors and shading to do. I am extremely happy with the rendered eyes, and I must say it felt good to finally get some sketching practice in. Flaring Hood. This Pokemon does not like to bite anyone, and will only do so if you don't leave him another option. If you do manage to anger this Pokemon enough for it to bite you, you must hurry yourself to a healing station, because its venom is strong enough to take down an entire group of Tauros. I can definitely see some flaws I made in the proportions and shape language, but I genuinely think this is a change for the better. It might get tough if I get back onto the legendaries though. For this design, I did decide to move away slightly from our reference piece, but that did result in quite a lot of fiddling in order to get something I was happy with. Once that finally happened, we added in the hole into his face where we could place in the eye, and turned his head crest into more spacey, mechanical ones. We also extended the gem on his head into a more robotic one, and then added 4 segments to divide a few of his body parts. Afterwards, we made sure to add a few more segment lines on the back parts of his body, and we gave him a robotic mouth as well. During the color process, I was shortly debating going for a purple variant for the lighted parts, but we changed it into yellow to fit him into the dragon electric typing. Iron Schneck. It is thought to be a drone made by an unknown civilization to research space and deeply underwater terrain. It is possibly collecting data to warn their people about natural disasters who are about to happen. Their special antennae are able to pick up vibrations, which they use to predict the possibilities of natural disasters. I could definitely see this Pokemon as an amazing helper on space missions, and even though its design is quite simple, I do think it works as a future form. Let me know if you would rather have the past or the future form of this line. Actually, do that for every Pokemon for today. On our last 2 pieces we started with the paradox elements from the beginning of the drawing, but from now on I wanted to do something different. In order to make sure the piece would feel like a Larvitar, we decided to first replicate the pose into a believable version of the Pokemon. Once we were satisfied with that, we dropped the opacity of that layer and added on the paradox elements, just like what we did with the tracing method. I've noticed that I'm much less focused on keeping the same elements of the Pokemon as I was with the tracing method. I've also managed to catch myself trying to be a lot more creative with these drawings. For this design I didn't want to build out his dinosaur look, but instead opted into a more caveman aesthetic. This is why the first thing we did was to add a bone onto his head shape. The next thing we added was a tail, and we gave him some sharp tiny fingers. I then got the idea of adding some fur all around his body, which gave me a clear direction for the rest of the piece, a woolly rhino. We added in some sharp toenails, and of course the biggest trademark of rhinos, the horn on his nose. We also added an extra mark to the top of his eye for an even more rough look. look. Last but not least, we gave him some rocks on his chest and added another bone, but this time on the tip of his tail. For the colors, we firstly wanted to go for an actual woolly rhino color palette, which is earthy and brown. Even though these colors looked amazing, it didn't feel as much as a Larvitar as I wanted. This is why we changed the colors into regular Larvitar colors and kept this color palette for a shiny. Woolly Horn. This Pokemon is known to live in colder areas. Their thick fat and fur allows it to shrug off snowstorms as if it was a light breeze. They slide bones through their fur to store them for later, as they use bone marrow to repair their own horn. I actually really like this piece. It is a simple change, but on the other hand, it does feel like a different Pokemon. I hope you guys aren't mad at me for the last minute color change, but we voted for it on the stream and now the shiny is absolutely worth hunting. This one was pretty easy to make, since we already had a good reference piece to follow, Iron Thorns. We started out by recreating the pose again and made sure to first do a shape language study in order to get to know how we have to build this Pokemon up ourselves. This genuinely made it a lot easier to replicate the pose, which meant that this portion of the drawing went by a lot faster than the previous one. After we managed to get the pose down, it was time to add in the futuristic elements. We started out by closing off his legs and added segment lines in the middle of them. We then added 2 holes in the right one and gave his tail a bar of lighted area on each part. After this, we added a segmentation onto his arms and added even more segment lines next to it. We were now able to focus on the most important part of the design, which was to give him big plated body armor, change his mouth into a mechanical one, added a lot of depth into his belly patch, made his feet more mechanical, and added one more big segmentation on the middle of his body to really sell the plated armor piece. We then only had to add minor details like a bunch of segment lines all around his body and opened up his eye socket in order to bring back the makeup of the regular Larvitar into the design. For the colors, I decided not to follow the color palette of Larvitar, but actually use the color palette of Iron Thorns instead. Iron Crunch. These creatures were commonly seen around ruins of what some believe to be cities of an unknown civilization. No one could safely enter the ruins to investigate them, as a group of Iron Crunchers would try to attack and repel all intruders. This made some suspect that they are used as guards by the people of those ruined cities. This is definitely one of my favorite future forms I've made so far, and I could 100% see this as the actual pre-evolution of Iron Thorns. For this drawing, I made a mistake to not do the shape language study first, which resulted in a longer sketching phase. This drawing wasn't going to be difficult though, since we once again had another reference piece to follow, Roaring Moon. We started out by drawing in the head and gave it a few tweaks to get it to fit the right perspective. We then moved on to his body, which wasn't necessarily difficult, but I did have to use our newly found tool a lot. Since the beginning of our sketching arc we started at this video, we didn't draw our shapes perfectly into a 3D atmosphere. Our shapes weren't completely wrong, but sometimes just needed a little tweaking in order to get them right. This is where the Liquify tool came into play. This tool basically makes you able to nudge and pull your drawing around with quite a good amount of precision. I believe this tool will be my savior until I'm actually capable of proper gesture drawing. It was now time to add in the past elements into the design. We started out by giving him a tail and immediately added some spikes on the side of his head. We also extended his belly pattern, gave him claws, some extra teeth, and a few more spikes on multiple areas of his body. For the colors, we did the same thing we did for Iron Crunch, which was using the color palette of the real Paradox Pokemon instead of the one of Bagon. Scaly Terror. This Pokemon's body is largely made up of muscle. With its strong jaw and beefy legs, it often challenges other Pokemon to battle, and it will not take no for an answer. It often finds itself getting pulverized when trying to challenge two strong Pokemon, like Great Tusk for example. When losing a battle, Scaly Terror keeps a mental note on who it has lost to, so it can rematch them after training. You might bring in the argument of this Pokemon looking more like a fusion between between Roaring Moon and Bagon, but I think that is actually what you need this Pokemon to be in order to fit them into one evolution line. We are now moving on to the future form of Bagon. Luckily, we did remember to do the shape language study this time. I have watched a bunch of tutorials where they always mention this part of the sketching phase, and I always knew they were right, but it never really clicked with my brain until now. This is definitely something I've noticed with a lot of elements during the last few months of drawing. We are finally starting to undergo the things the amazing YouTubers talk about in their videos. After our quick study was done, we started out by firstly drawing in the head shape again. It took me some time to get everything to look right, but we eventually managed to pull it off. The body quickly followed, since it basically consists of 3 circular shapes with only 2 lines connecting it to the head. We then simply added in the arms and moved on to the futuristic elements. I must admit that I took a huge amount of inspiration from the design of Iron Crunch. Especially the middle part of his body is almost identical, and I did play around with the exact same arms, but those felt too similar, so I didn't use them. The most important parts of this transformation were in fact the middle part of his body. The segmentation in his neck and legs, and the segment lines on his head crest really helped the robotic look as well. I did face one struggle point, which was what to do with the legs. I didn't want to just add the same hole into them like we did for Iron Crunch. This is why I decided to place them more on the outside of the leg. The colors were basically the same, except for the lighted parts, which we made blue to play into his part water typing. Iron Engine. This Pokemon appears to be the result of humans finally figuring out how to create an engine purely running on water. It is capable of generating extreme amounts of energy, which it must release with high-speed water blasts. Rumors say that the creator of this Pokemon mysteriously disappeared upon discovering it actually worked. I am actually happy with this design. I feel like it's a good balance of Bagon and a robot. I must admit that I completely forgot this Pokemon was a Pseudo Legendary as well, because I was in the understanding that there was only one available spot for a Pseudo Legendary in every region. Well, my bad. Let's start on the shape study. Beldum exists out of a circle for his head, a circle-shaped plate for his bottom, a triangular cylinder, and a rectangle for the piece on his head. Once we figured that out, we started on our drawing. We drew in a circle for his head and a circle where we would place the bottom of his body. We then added some thickness to the bottom shape and connected it to his head. I followed it up by adding a segment in his neck and by drawing in the rectangular shape on his back. After adding in the eye, it was time to make changes to the basic shapes. We did this in order to make them look like the roughed up Beldum we know. This took a little bit of tweaking, but wasn't actually difficult. The only thing we had to do was to add the segment lines and redraw the basic shapes to fit the squared look. Once all of these elements were in place, it was time to move on to the past elements. My idea for the typing was either Psychic Rock or Rock Grass. I know the second typing wouldn't be possible with the paradox rules, but it would have been awesome. Luckily, for all the rule-loving people, we did a poll on stream and democracy decided on the first typing. The changes we made weren't even that big either, and for the most part we just roughed out the elements he has on the regular design, which eventually turned his Beldum into an ancient looking rock. I did decide to add a crack in the middle of his body to spice up the design and fit him even closer to the part Psychic typing. For the colors I did decide to move away from the paradox rules because I felt like a desert color palette would fit this Pokemon perfectly. I did bring the regular colors back for a shiny though. Holy Sentinel. This Pokemon is often found in Sky Pillar, Thea Sky Ruins, and the Hoenn Desert Ruins, guarding the legendary Pokemon that lie within these structures. Its energy core can be seen through its midsection, and if struck, it will cause Holy Sentinel to briefly get stunned. I am extremely happy with the end result of this Pokemon. I can only imagine how freaking amazing the evolutions of this guy will look like. We did do a shape study again, but after we were done with that, I got completely lost with what I wanted to do with this design. Beldum already looks a lot like a future form, and I didn't just want to add a few tiny changes and call it a day. This made me try a few different ideas, and I'm not sure if these designs were the result of me being tired or if I just was trolling a little. We tried to turn Beldum into a missile, which would have been cool as a concept, but my execution was horrible. Luckily I did see that during the drawing process, so we changed it into a different route. My first idea was to turn Beldum into a post-apocalyptic version, but like I said, that would have been just a basic rusted Beldum. This is why I decided to completely change his body into a more WoW-y looking version. We separated his head from his body and added some arms to the design as well. We also wanted to find a way for it to move, and I didn't want to just make him float because I wanted it to look like the Last Survivor, which had to be rebuilt. This made me give him a wheel under his body and finished up the rest of his design with a bunch of plated, reused metals. I will say that at a certain point, I didn't believe this piece would come together. And to be fair, the only way to save this being a future form of Beldum was to use its regular colors. I do think this genuinely might have saved this design, but let me know if you think this was too much, or if it was actually pretty cool to see such a drastic change for once. Iron Warbot infest enormous fields of an unknown civilization. A lot of dysfunctioning, seriously damaged iron warbots were found lying everywhere. The few still functioning iron warbots were quick to attack, leading some to believe they were used as a common soldier that people of this civilization used to engage in massive wars. Some individuals were seen trying to attach parts of their fallen comrades to themselves, but it rarely was done successfully. I don't know about this design. It is kinda cute, but it is also kinda weird. I will say that his evolutions are probably going to be a bit different, unless you guys appear to actually love this design. I created a brush set with all my favorite brushes. I use each of them with every drawing that I make, so if you want to draw in the same style as me, I recommend checking out my website. For only €5.99, you can get the Procreate brush set, which you will be able to use in Procreate. It includes an amazing line art brush, a highlight brush which instantly makes your pieces look a lot better, and many other fantastic brushes. I also want to have a written down version of how to create Paradox Pokemon. That's why I created this step-by-step guide. It's easy to follow, and I added a bunch more tips you can use while drawing. You will also get the work files of the 2 Paradox Pokemon we created, and I added 2 work files with just a line art so you can practice coloring and shading. This guide is also available for €5.99 on my website, but since I thought you guys might be interested in buying it together with the brush set, I made it into a combi deal for only €8.99 for the both of them. That is a 25% discount, so I know what I would do. I knew from the start that I wanted to bring the beta sprite back into existence, but I didn't want to just make that as the Paradox form. I wanted to combine the 2 different forms into one design. We started out by breaking down the body of the beta sprite into easily understandable shapes. Once we had the basic anatomy down, we started to bring back some elements we know from the actual Gible we got, like the shapes on his head, the markings on his back, and we brought back his tail as well. I must admit that it took me quite a lot of time to figure out how to add the eye into the design. We mainly struggled to find the right perspective between the eye socket and the nose, since we wanted it to look sideways instead of being able to see part of the other eye as well. We eventually just added an eye socket right under his top armor. We then played around with a different kind of mouth, but decided to use a basic one instead, since we weren't able to make something that looked great due to the limited color palette. The last change we made were some slight tweaks with the liquefy tool to turn his snout into a sharper one, which makes him look more like a shark. For the colors, I decided to use the color palette from regular Gible to make it more recognizable as a Paradox form of it. We did bring back the beta Gible colors for its shiny though. Biting Beta. While this Pokemon can stand on just its 2 legs, it loses its balance easily easily due to the shape of its body. It is known to scutter through warm caves, searching for prey that it can lock its jaw around and then drag them back to its nest to eat them. I genuinely love the fact I was able to not only bring the beta design into reality, but actually combine both designs into something new. I think this shiny definitely adds a lot of potential to this line as well. I 100% had some fun with the study for this piece, because Gible is basically just one bullet shape with some stubby arms and legs and a big chunk taken out of it as its mouth. It is pretty cool to see that we're really starting to be able to break down complicated drawings into simple shapes. It was a bit difficult to get the mouth completely perfect though, because there are a few elements you have to place in the right perspective, and even if you fail on one of those, the entire mouth looks off. Once we were done with the body and pose, it was time to drop the opacity of the layer and start adding in the future elements. We began by breaking up his head crest into a bunch of segments, and we made an eye socket for the screen. Our next step was to segment his arms and legs, and we made sure to break off the tail from the rest of his body. After this, we spent some time turning his toes and fingers into separate elements, and while the toes were kinda easy, the fingers appeared to be in the wrong direction. I think we spent like 5 minutes trying to fix this, but we eventually succeeded. This only left a few small elements to do, like the segment line on his legs, the holes in the shapes next to his head and top of his arm, the actual segmentation of his tail, and we added some more segment lines to his tongue, back, and mouth. The colors weren't different from the regular color palette, and we used a light blue one for the lighted parts, which opened up the ability to turn this thing into a dragon ice type. Iron Cannon. This Pokemon is a ball of energy, ready to open its jaws and fire energy blasts from its gaping mouth. It prefers to stay in groups, as they are very vulnerable while shooting out energy, so they can stick together to watch each other's backs. I am kinda happy with this design, but I have no clue what it will do for its evolution and if it will remain a cannon. This was one of those pieces where the shape language study was kinda easy to understand, but where you struggle with replicating it in the right size. This is probably the thing I have the most amount of improvement left in sketching, getting the proportions right of the things we draw. I know anatomy is another huge part of sketching which I have no knowledge of, but I'm talking about my current drawing process. Our first sketch of the body looked like an obese version of Deino, so we had to transform it a few times to get it to the right weight. It did also take me some time to make sure all the feet were facing the same way. This is one of those skills I'm genuinely jealous of, so if anyone has some good tips on making sure all elements align with one another, let me know. Now that all of these elements were in, it was time to move on to the past features. My goal for this piece was to turn Deino into an actual dino. We started by giving his feet some sharp toenails and gave him a big tail to balance his body, somewhat like sauropods. We then used the liquefy tool a few times on his face to fix a few minor mistakes, and then added more fur to the side of his head. We also gave him some big horns on the top of his head and added small teeth in his mouth. Last but not least, we gave his tail some markings and gave him some scales on the top of his front legs. Stomping Deino. This Pokemon has trouble seeing through the thick fur that covers its eyes, meaning it's almost impossible for it to hunt on prey. This means that it mostly survives off of leaves and berries for sustenance, despite being a carnivore. If forced to battle, Stomping Deino blindly throws around its body, hoping it will hit the opponent. Even though these changes were quite minimal, I do think they were big enough to change the actual feeling of the Pokemon. It definitely feels a lot sturdier and stronger now. We started with the shape study of an interesting pose, but I wasn't able to capture it in the same essence as the artist from the original piece did. This is why I decided to go for a different pose instead. I immediately saw that this was a lot easier to replicate, and before I knew it, the pose was on my canvas, which made us able to move into the futuristic elements. Luckily, this was another piece where we could take huge reference from a real Paradox Pokemon, Iron Jugulus. This Pokemon is supposed to function as a pre-evolution for it, which makes us able to bring back a lot of the same elements, like the neck and the same lighted area color. The other changes weren't necessarily super difficult to add into the design, but I was struggling with them nonetheless. The biggest issue I faced was that his neck color blocked a lot of his body, and this didn't leave me a lot of room to add the elements I usually add to future forms. The end result is not something I'm the happiest with, mainly because his belly, and probably because I wasn't able to add the eyes onto it either. I did try to work around this issue by adding 2 lighted parts on the shapes on his face, but it doesn't have the same effect as robot eyes would have had.
Iron Kermit. This Pokemon lives in a time where the world is in a constant drought with harsh sunlight. The shades over its eyes act as a filter to protect its eyes from the light. Its neck has a built-in fan to keep itself from overheating from battling and the intense heat.
The typing for this piece is Dark Dragon, since the final stage is a Dark Flying type, but I didn't see this Pokemon as something that flies, so I decided to use this typing until he reaches his final form. This piece was incredibly easy to do, but I will say that it was extremely hard to come up with a paradox form of this Pokemon, instead of it looking like a regional variant. I do think the end result looks more like a regional variant though. My way of trying to make Goomy into a prehistoric version of himself was to change his body into tar and to change his whiskers into more bone looking ones. The reason for this was that falling into a tar pit was a death sentence for any animal who was so lucky to do so. This is why I made his whiskers look like bones, as if it carries around the remains of the Pokemon he trapped in his body. I probably should have added a few more bones all around his body to make this look even more like that is the case, but he does look a lot more natural in this way. For the colors we decided to make his body black, but I did have to be careful to not make it look too similar to Paldean and Wooper, because we already used the same whiskers. So, is this my best paradox form ever? Most definitely not. I do like it as a regional form though.
Sticky Tar. This Pokemon tries to lay out traps for unsuspecting prey to walk into. Once trapped, there is no escaping this sticky ball of doom, and it will feed itself so much that it isn't able to move for a few days.
For all the people who will say I had to use the original colors as a paradox Pokemon, calm down, I added them for a shiny. I can already tell you that I'm much happier with this piece than I was with the past form of it. We started out by adding in the pose, but this was done in only 2 minutes. Afterwards it was time to bring in the futuristic elements again, and we began by adding a screen on the middle of his face. We also gave a bunch of segment lines to the whiskers on the top of his head. We followed that up by making some holes in the circles he has on his cheeks and back. Now that these changes were in, we gave him tracks on the bottom part of his body, as if he would crawl around like a small tank. Last but not least, we gave him a belly patch and added some very important segment lines on the top of his screen. This instantly added a bit more depth into the design, and after some more abuse of the Liquify tool, we were ready to move on to the colors. I decided to keep most of the colors the same, but went with a slightly brighter version of green for the lighted parts. I did that because this would make it seem a bit more like neon and would help me push into the part poison typing.
Iron Jelly. This Pokemon is a valuable companion to have by your side, as the goo it produces is so sticky it can hold together the heaviest of items. Its goo is most commonly used by mechanics and engineers to help them hold together pieces of technology and repairing damaged robots. However, if this Pokemon gets angry, the hormones in its body changes the composition of its goo, which makes it highly toxic. This is why they're treated with utmost respect and care in the workplace.
I am extremely happy with the end result of this piece, and I think the shiny of it looks even better. I would 100% add this Pokemon to my team, and I can't wait to see what his evolutions will look like. We once again started with a shape language study, which we aren't using to its full extent yet, but we will be fixing that for the next drawing. Once we finished the study, it was time to turn it into our own sketch. But instead of using the shapes we just learned, we just tried to replicate the details we saw on its body. This is definitely counterproductive, but like I said, more on that with the next drawing. The body did actually start to take shape, but even though I really liked how I was able to draw his legs properly, it still looked a bit off. I figured it was most likely because of the proportions, so we made his body a lot smaller while making his head bigger. This really helps to sell a first stage Pokemon instead of a middle stage one. I can tell we're getting better at sketching by the amount of the liquify tool we use now. At first this was quite a lot, but I'm barely using it anymore. Now that the pose and proportions were in place, it was time to add the prehistoric elements into the design. We quite quickly decided that we're going to take some inspiration from Ankylosaurs, hence why we gave him a big rock at the end of his tail. This immediately opened the part rock typing, and we used that as a guide to transform his scales into rocks too. The next thing we added were a lot of spikes on the top of his scales, his neck, and we added some teeth to his mouth, which technically are spikes as well. At this point I felt like it didn't look feral enough, so we added a big crest of feathers to the back of his head, and we changed his heart shape into a rocky variant too. The last thing we did was to give him some makeup under his eyes, and added some tiny feathers to the side of his arms. The colors weren't drastically different, but at first I did add the yellow color for the stones on his back, but this made it look badly because of the spikes being yellow already. This is exactly why I brought back the grey color onto them, so let's just pretend these rocks can be two colors.
Native Pride. This Pokemon attracts mates by showing off the rocky scales on its back and the feathers on its head. The bigger they are, the more likely it is that Native Pride will get a mate. This isn't the only use of its scales, however. They are sturdy and each of them has a spike on it, meaning they are a great weapon for offense and defense.
I think I did an amazing job on this piece. I'm not saying it's the best Paradox design ever, but I am super happy we were able to draw a quadrupedal Pokemon. This is the design where we have begun with the optimal way of sketching in my opinion. This should be the method that will eventually make us able to draw anything we want. Yeah, that sounds amazing. So what do? You turn the body into super easy to understand shapes, like squares, circles, and triangles. This makes it so you don't have to worry about hard details, and you train your brain to be able to replicate the easy shapes instead of getting lost in the process. Once you've built out the entire body out of those simple shapes, you go into a new layer and add the actual details of the Pokemon. This was the first time I did this seriously, and boy can I say it helped tremendously. For once it felt like I was in control of my own sketch, instead of just copying the pose and trying to draw it in the best way I could. We did make another mistake on the proportions, but we used the exact same fix we did for the first drawing. Once the body was done, we moved on to the futuristic elements. We started out by making a hole to place the screens for his eye. We followed that up by adding a big belly patch and by segmenting his leg and tail. We also added some depth into his front leg, which left us only a few things to do. A segment on his neck and just a lot more segment lines on some parts of his body. For the colors I opted to keep the lighted part yellow, to one fit the regular color palette and two fit him into the part electric typing.
Ironheart. Compared to their present form, Ironheart is much more nimble and durable. This is why it's a fighting type and Jangmo-o isn't. Its skills are more fragile than one might think, so it can't clank them together to make sounds. It instead uses a speaker in its mouth to scare off foes and communicate with its friends. It is a highly intelligent creature.
I am once again just really happy with this piece. I just really like the subtle changes future forms bring onto the table, while also making the Pokemon feel like an actual different Pokemon. By the way, look at his shiny. God tier right there. At a first glance I thought this would have been an easy Pokemon to transform, but I was wrong. It took me quite a while to even get the pose ready, and once we did achieve that, I was pretty clueless on what to do with the design itself. Luckily, this changed when I got the idea to go completely crazy with this design. I took huge inspiration from Dia de la Muerto, or probably how I should say it, the Day of the Dead. I am completely sorry for the butchering of this pronunciation. If you don't know what that looks like, I recommend googling it, or you might know the movie Coco, where they show exactly what my reference is. Our first thing we changed were some more feathers all around his body to add some more color to the design. We then added some bones to his neck, which led us to the biggest change we gave Dreepy, the change of his face into a skull looking one. After this we gave him some sharp teeth and a few spikes on his head. This meant the design itself was done and that we could start adding in the colors. At first I wanted to use the regular color palette of Dreepy, but felt this would be too boring, hence why we moved into a more interesting purple color palette. I definitely think this helped make the design even better, but there was still one more thing to do: eyes. I wasn't sure if I wanted to bring them into the design, because without them, it could actually add to the eerie feeling of the design. We did decide to add them though, since this made it look a lot more like a Pokemon, and it still looked quite scary.
Ghostly Reaper. This Pokemon has the incredible ability to look into the afterlife, but due to it being a pre-evolution, it isn't quite strong enough to communicate or enter the afterlife. It is, however, able to gather energy from its deceased relatives and harnesses that energy to power up its attacks.
You might be thinking that the animation looks a bit weird and extreme, but that was exactly what I was going for. I wanted it to look a bit off and creepy, and yeah, I would not want to meet this Pokemon late at night. I got a lot of requests to make this Pokemon into a missile, and even though I like the idea of that, I am not a huge fan of Objectmons. This is why I decided not to make him look too much like a missile, but to play around with the lore for that department. We started out by adding a lot of segments on his body and detached the arms from the rest of it too. We also added a part of lighted area onto them and gave it a more metallic aesthetic. For his face we opted into some car-like looking eye holes and gave him a metallic plate on the place of his nose. It was a bit tricky to make the eye holes feel right in a 3D atmosphere, but I think we managed to make it look believable. Last but not least, we removed the end of his tail and replaced it with a strong looking rocket jet. For this piece we did decide to keep the same color palette and made the pink into the lighted color.
Iron Missile. As its name implies, this Pokemon is able to fold its body to make it as streamlined as possible to be shot out of its evolutions. It has the speed of a bullet with the strength of a missile. It doesn't just have to rely on its evolutions, however, it can pick up speed extremely fast and is one of the fastest Pokemon despite only being the first stage of its line.
I mean, it isn't perfect, that's for sure, but I don't dislike it either. It gives me the vibe of the robot in the movie Treasure Planet. Definitely one of the best movies I watched as a kid, and still think it's one of the best underrated animated movies ever, story-wise of course. We started out by doing another shape study, and we found out that this Pokemon consists out of only a few easy to replicate shapes. A big circle for the main part of his body, and the rest are easily made out of a few circles as well. This definitely resulted in a quick replication of the pose, and the past elements quickly followed. My idea for this Pokemon was to turn it into an Ice-Fire typing, because I feel like we already have enough Dragon Pseudo Legendaries. The first thing I changed was to make his wristbands look a lot closer to flames, and made his eyelid into a fuzzy looking eyebrow. We then played around with giving him toenails, but this felt over designed, so we scrapped this idea. We did take a good look at all of the already existing past Paradox Pokemon and decided to bring back an element which quite a few of them have, the pointy mouth. I must say that even though it's such a small detail, it does actually help to make him look closer to a dinosaur. Up next were some spikes to the top of his legs and the tip of his tail. We also gave some markings on the upper part of his head and gave some makeup under his eye. We then made 2 chips in his back spike, and last but not least, we extended the marking on his belly into rough looking eyes. The color palette didn't change drastically, but we did go a bit crazy for a shiny though.
Frosty Bite. This Pokemon spends most of its time lazing about in tall, cold mountains. Thanks to its small stomach and large amount of body fat, it rarely needs to go out and hunt for food. Its insides are so hot that it can eat food raw, and the food will be cooked from the sheer temperature alone.
I genuinely really like this design. Once again a quite basic change, but it just looks so more rough and angry, which is a lot of fun because his proportions still make him look like a cute little guy. It is now time for a final design of today, the future form of Frigibax. This time we were referencing a different pose, but the shapes were still the same and we managed to put down the pose in no time. This made us able to start on the future elements and we began by adding some big holes for the eyes. We followed it up by giving him a big robotic jaw and added a sharp mouth onto it. We then added some holes instead of his nostrils and proceeded with blocking off both his leg and arms. We also closed off his fingers and toes and added a robotic line onto his tail. After this we gave the illusion of depth to the shape on his belly and finished up the design by adding some segment lines between his eyebrow ridges. For the colors I decided to stay close to the original palette, but we did add some metallic colors and a dark color for his jaw. I didn't feel like using a different color for his lighted parts because I think yellow is mandatory for this Pokemon to feel like Frigibax.
Iron Fridge. This Pokemon can easily adjust the temperature of its body, which makes him able to store your drinks in its mouth to keep them cool for later. However, it is so small that it's only able to cool one drink at a time. Still, a very handy Pokemon to take on adventures, and that's why it's very popular amongst family households, as it is literally a portable refrigerator.
Yes. This is 100% my favorite design of every design I've ever made. It is so freaking derpy and I absolutely love this little dude. Yeah, I really mean little dude. Just look at his size. Well, these were all the 20 Paradox forms we made for the first stage Pseudo Legendaries. And next week we'll have a video with 8 more designs for their evolutions. We will also have another episode of the Collabo region and let me know which design was your favorite today. Goodbye.